Now, still talking about Africa Day celebration, joining me on the news to discuss the relevance of this day to Africans on the continent is historian, scholar activist, and co-convener of the Pan-Afrikan Consciousness Renaissance, PACOR, Dr. Temitope Maberu Fagunwa. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Temitope.
My pleasure. Can I be asked?
Yeah. Happy Africa Day to you.
Yeah, happy African Day to every one of us.
All right, Dr. Temitope, let's talk about the theme for Africa Day for this year. Now, the theme this year is food insecurity and malnutrition, which has been amplified by the global crisis such as climate change, COVID-19, just to mention a few. What do you think African leaders can do to best tackle this situation?
Well, I think this theme is coming at a very good time, because particularly we are talking at a time where reports have it that, a country like Nigeria, for an instance, that beginning with August 2022, that the rate of people who really do not have access to food would, skyrocketed. So what that really means is that the team seems to, meet up with the social realities and conditions, unfortunately, of the African continent. There's a report that about, say, for August 2022, for instance, close to about 20 million Nigerians won't have access or will be victims of food insecurity. So this is really coming at the right time. But unfortunately, we have an African ruling class, or we have, so-called leaders of the African continent who really do not care about these realities. Because take for instance, across the, across the African continent, we have a situation where the entirety of the lands, seems to have been hijacked, by all sorts of both state and non-state actors. Across the continent, we're dealing with insecurity, not just, because you must understand the fact that the question of food insecurity is it's a multifaceted reality. Violence across the African continent, instigated by both state and non-state actors, seems to be at the heart of this issue. Beyond this reality also, we have currently a continent that its economy seems to be under the whims and caprices of, a tiny minority. Beyond that, we also have a continent that is currently indebted to the international finance capital. So what that really means is that we are dealing with a continent that is really not ready, or we have leaders on the continent that are really not ready to discuss how best we can solve the crisis of food insecurity. Because today, access to land, to the mass of the people to produce, what they have to eat isn't really there. Across the African continent, we have leaders that have done monopolize, the lands that ordinarily ought to be under the control of the Agrarian people. Land grabbing today is an issue. So beyond the question of insecurity, killings here and there, terrorism and what have you, we also have the crisis of land grabbing. And these are issues that have been able to propel, the existence of food insecurity more than any other time. So for us, we must understand the trajectory of this issue, how this issue, emanated in the first instance. And, moving forward, I think that the mass of the African people must be able to hold, their government across board, responsible for these issues. The African leaders ordinarily will not man up over this responsibility. And that is why for the African masses, those that have been reduced to nothing, there is a necessity, there is the urgency for them to begin to demand for the redistribution of land, because it is only when land, people are being granted that necessary access to land that we can then begin to talk about, accurate ways at which the question of food insecurity can be solved. If lands, are not really being redistributed, we cannot begin to talk about how to solve the crisis of food insecurity.
Great. Now, Dr. Temitope, do you think, in your own perspective, that it's high time African leaders united to ensure the continent lives up to its full capacity? And I mean, looking at how African leaders, or Africa itself, is endowed with numerous natural resources. So do you think it's high time that, we united as Africans to ensure that the continent actually lives up to its full capacity?
Well, you see, the question of African unity has been for quite some time now. And I think the father of Pan-Africanism, Ancestor Kwame Nkrumah, initiated that that position that the African continent must necessarily unite. We must unite against the forces of imperialism, neocolonialism, and what have you. And Nkrumah went across the continent in the 60s, propagating this idea for the mass of African people to understand. But Nkrumah did not raise this banner, particularly for backward leaders, because we must understand the basis upon which the question of African unity seems to be relevant at whatever point in time, till this time, because, you cannot have the unity of weaklings. If you have the unity of weaklings, you would, the result that will come out from that would be nothing.
Yeah,
be
that's very
insignificant.
True. That's very true.
So
I apologize, Dr. Temitope, but because of our time, I'll just like to ask one more question. I'm really sorry for cutting you right there, but my final question before we let you go is, what do you think is the solution for Africa to free itself from this reliance on the West for economic growth?
It's simple. I think what we must do, what we must necessarily do, is not to surrender our liberation to those currently in government. Those currently in government across the continent have failed us enormously well. There is no way out which you can best moralize this discussion. So what we are saying at this time is for the mass of African people to stand up, and kick out all of these forces of neocolonialism. The forces of neocolonialism we have today on the continent are those so-called misrulers that we have across, the countries. Beyond that, we have the International Finance Capital Agencies, the IMF, the World Bank. These are criminal organizations, whose existence have been able to, wreck the economy of the African continent. So moving forward, the mass of African people, radical organizations, radical-minded Africans, genuine-minded Africans who are interested in the liberation of the African people or the African continent must come together to say that to hell with all of these forces of neocolonialism, to hell with the Buharis of the world who are really not interested in the liberation of the continent, to hell with the Nana of Ghana. These are elements that have done sold out the entirety of the continent, to the highest bidder. So moving forward, the mass of African people, the radical organization must come together to kick out all of these elements and enthrone, well radical, socialist alternative, an economic system that will allow the mass of the people to be able, to get what they deserve, their dues, an economic system that will ensure that lands, for instance, are being redistributed so that the mass of the African people will have access to land, because look at Nigeria, for instance, you have, lands, you have, buildings that are not occupied, but you find out that some of the buildings are being owned by the mass, by members of the ruling class. So we are saying that the mass of the people across the continent must rise up to this occasion. We have that, obligation, that duty to defeat neocolonialism. If we do not defeat neocolonialism, the type of the problems we're facing today will not, vanish.
Very, very true. Thank you so much, Dr. Temitope. Thank you for joining us on the news, and thank you for giving your own perspective to this matter. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure.